So, good afternoon, everyone. This is the second in the School of Public Policy's series of talks and other events this year. I'm David Mednikov. I'm chair of the Judaic and Near Eastern Studies Department and associate professor in public policy and Middle Eastern Studies. And I'm also the co-chair of the Public Engagement and Outreach Committee for School of Public Policy this year. In thinking about events that we would do this fall, we definitely wanted to be cognizant both of social justice issues that have been very important in this crazy 2020 that we're still enduring. And obviously, I think right now on everybody's mind is the election. I guess if it isn't on your mind, it probably should be on your mind. I mean, this is, you can vote now. Many of us I know already have. And I know many people are involved in phone banking, writing letters, thinking about voter protection. And as a public policy professor, of course, I want to encourage you, even though the next few weeks I know are going to be difficult for all of us, to try to do all those things. I think it's very important, for those of you who are student age. I think when you hear from professors our age that this seems like, the most significant election that we've experienced for a long time. I don't think people, I think that people don't feel hyperbole around that. So it's an important time. The election is on our mind, and so we thought that it would be worthwhile to have somebody who really knew what they were talking about and with a lot of significant experience to help guide us through some of the challenges. I mean, one of them is various ways in which we see voter suppression and challenges to the ability of people's votes to actually count. These are challenges that are not new, but they're very much and appropriately so in the public eye, particularly as we also think about the Supreme Court and its role moving forward and in voting litigation. So for these reasons, we thought that it would be really good to have somebody who's an expert. Before I introduce our wonderful expert speaker, I just want to mention that our next event, kind of bookending this, is the Thursday night after the election. We're going to have a 7:30 p.m. SPP kind of town meeting on the election, and we're not assuming we're going to necessarily know all the information we want, but we think it'll be a good time for the community to check in. So if you haven't already done so, please mark on your calendar the Thursday evening after the election at 7:30. We'll have a virtual event to try to connect on the election. And then my colleague who is here, Professor Lee Badgett, is going to be presenting her book in our next formal talk later in November. So there'll be more detail about that. Okay, great. So it's my real pleasure to introduce Professor Gilda Daniels. Professor Daniels was our first choice for somebody who could help us to think through voter suppression and voter issues more broadly. And I was so delighted that within 15 minutes or so of my inviting her, she graciously accepted our invitation. So it's really delightful. Professor Daniels is a voting rights expert and the former deputy chief in the United States Department of Justice Civil Rights Division voting section, where she served in both the Clinton and Bush administrations. So, she comes to this issue with a lot of important, specific experience, which I hope people will ask about during the Q&A later. She is currently a professor of law at the University of Baltimore Law School and the director of litigation for the Advancement Project's National Office, a multiracial civil rights organization. And as you can see from her screen, and I'm going to show you this as well, she is the author of a 2020, a very timely book on voter suppression. And it's a book that Ms. Magazine called Required Reading. I've read it, and it's really fantastic in giving us like a very, I think, accessible and thoughtful and experienced overview of the various issues around voter suppression, and kind of an historical view that obviously that underscores, I think, meaningfully that voter suppression is nothing new. This is not something that we just are waking up to. I mean, there's lots of continuity in American history. So that's kind of a preview of the book. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Daniels. As usual, she'll have 35, 40 minutes to chat, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A. I will moderate the Q&A and the usual rules of either private chatting me a question or just sending a chat to the whole group that's a question in order. If you do that, then I will call on you as I see the questions after Professor Daniels done speaking. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you so much, Professor Daniels. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor, and thank you so much to UMass Amherst School of Public Policy. It is my pleasure and honor to speak to you today about this, what I think is a very important topic. Of course, it is everybody's mind is on voting, and I think what I'm doing in my talks and on college campuses and elsewhere is just helping us to frame this in a way that I think others are not. As you are aware, I've written a book. It's Uncounted, the Crisis of Voter Suppression in America. And I wrote the book in large part because I wanted to connect the dots. So I love, even today, I must say, as a child, and I loved working with these connect the dot pages. It's just a sheet of paper that has numbers on it. And you have to go from number 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, etc. And as you draw those lines from one dot to the other, you start seeing a picture form. And in those connected dot pages, it would be a picture. You'd end up with a picture of a flower or a house or something, or a car or something of that sort. But in those connected dot pages, if you had to connect the dots in order, and if you didn't, you got a picture that was essentially disfigured, right? The picture was not an accurate depiction of what was intended. So I wrote Uncounted because I wanted to connect the dots in regards to our voting process and the existence, certainly the existence of voter suppression, and certainly that voter suppression is real. I saw books that talked about voter ID or talked about voter fraud, but there wasn't I didn't find anything that talked about these various areas, talked about voter ID and felon disenfranchisement and voter deception and other mechanisms. And I talk about these issues and connecting these dots. I think it's important to connect these dots to history as well as to what we're experiencing contemporaneously. And looking at, and all of my writing certainly has a theme, and that's the connections or the intersections of race, law, and democracy. And so looking at our democratic process from that prism, I think is helpful. But certainly the first dot that I think we need to, I think the starting point for this discussion, and so as well as how we can frame this, is that we need to look at history. And certainly in the history in our country, because I say that we have this paradoxical democracy. At the same time that we were saying all men are created equal, the founding fathers also created a 3/5 compromise. The founding fathers said that, everyone should be treated equally, but then they determined that enslaved persons would only be counted as 3/5 of white persons for the purposes of apportionment. So for the purpose of determining how many representatives each state would receive, in the South, they would count enslaved persons as less than whole, right? So it's 3/5 of a person, and that was for the purposes of apportionment. So from the beginning of our country, our founding fathers decided that for the purposes of voting and representation, that there will be some votes that would count for less than white votes. And indeed, for the founding fathers, the only people who were entitled to vote at the founding of our country were white men who owned property. So those were the clear demarcations that were set from the beginning of our country, from saying all men are created equal to only some people count in regards to how we vote. And one of the things I talk about in the book is certainly how I see these cycles. I see that we have these cycles of progress and cycles of regress, and we certainly see that there's about certainly a 100-year cycle, if you will. I saw that there's like 100 years. There's almost 100 years from the all men are created equal and the 3/5 compromise to the passage of the Civil War amendments. Now we know that the 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment gave us equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment gave African-American men the right to vote. The 15th Amendment says that you cannot discriminate based on race. And so with the passage of the 15th Amendment, we saw Black men voting certainly for the first time. So formerly enslaved persons took on this mantle of full citizenship, right, where they could register, cast a ballot, and there are historians who said that approximately 2,000 Black men were elected in state, local, and federal government in this short period of Reconstruction. That is amazing. So you take persons who were formerly enslaved, and in a very short period of time, we're talking about 15 years or less, they are being elected at such a high level. In fact, in places like Mississippi, where the first Black United States Senator was elected, Hiram Revels was elected from the state of Mississippi. And Mississippi actually elected 2 African Americans to the United States Senate. We haven't had 2 United States senators elected from the South since the 1890s. We only have 3 African Americans in the United States Senate today: Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, and Tim Scott. So from 1890 to 2020, you've had a net gain of 1, it's only the first time probably in a decade that we've only had 3 persons elected to the United States Senate. It's probably, I think it's less than 10 years that has been the case. So that's an example of the level to which Black men took on all of the benefits associated with citizenship and especially the right to vote, and certainly demonstrates how well they were able to do so. Now, there's a chapter in my book where I have a subheading that says "Free at last, not so fast." So while they were exercising their right to vote, there was also another compromise that came into effect, and it's the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which is very interesting to talk about, certainly at a time of today, where there was a compromise where essentially the presidential election was too close to call, and so they came to a compromise on who would be in office and how and what compromises would occur. And that one of the compromises was that they would remove the Union troops from the formerly Confederate states. That is important because it provided federal protection for Black men to exercise their right to vote. Now, with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise and the removal of the federal troops, that certainly created this period of, we went from a period of Reconstruction to a period of redemption, where the white supremacists said that they were redeeming the South and essentially taking the South back from those newly enfranchised persons and saying that they wanted to return it to the white segregationists and white supremacists. And another part of the Hayes-Tilden Compromise was that those, in order to return to the Union, those states had to adopt the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Well, they indeed adopted those amendments, but at the same time, during those constitutional conventions, they implemented disenfranchising devices like the poll tax, like literacy tests, grandfather clauses. The grandfather clause essentially said that you could vote if your grandfather could vote, but your grandfathers had to have been able to vote prior to the passage of the 15th Amendment. Now, remember I told you the 15th Amendment said that you could not discriminate based on race and gave Black men the right to vote. Well, Pitchfork and his comrades, and it wasn't just South Carolina, it was South Carolina, it was Louisiana, it was Georgia, it was Alabama, it was Mississippi, it was Texas, it was Florida, it was North Carolina, right? Those Confederate states had these constitutional conventions and started implementing these nefarious ways of preventing Black men from exercising the franchise. And they were so effective in their pursuits that these measures, for example, in a place like Alabama, prior to its constitutional convention, there were approximately 146,000 Black men who were registered to vote. After the implementation of these disenfranchising devices like a poll tax, literacy tests, and let's not forget economic terror. If you voted, you could lose your land and you could also lose your life. And violence was also a tactic that was used certainly throughout that period. The state of Alabama went from 146,000 Black men registered in 1896 to in 1906 having 46. So from 146,000 to 46 Black men were able to register, remain registered after these constitutional conventions and implementation of these disenfranchising devices, because these constitutional conventions had as their intent to remove Black men from the, remove their ability to vote. We also know that during this time, certainly in the 1900s, women gained the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. We had the 15th Amendment, and then you had this massive voter participation for Black men, and then you have the period of redemption where they are passing these disenfranchising laws, and then you have the 19th Amendment where you have, when we celebrated 100 years of the 19th Amendment this year, where women received the right to vote. It's important to note that not all women received the right to vote with passage of the 19th Amendment. I use my grandmother as a framework in my book. My grandmother was born in 1919, and she should have voted for the first time in the 1940s, right? Because at that time you had to be 21 in order to vote. Should have voted for the first time in the 1940s, but my grandmother's a Black woman who lived in Louisiana. And she voted for the first time in the 1960s, right? Because those mechanisms that they adopted in the early 1900s, the literacy test, the poll tax, the grandfather clause, violence, economic terror, were all things that remained even after the passage of the 19th Amendment for Black and brown women and Black and brown people in the South and Southwest. So despite the passage of the 15th and the 19th Amendments, certainly Black and brown people throughout the South and Southwest still remained locked out from the ballot box. You also see Native Americans weren't even considered citizens until 1924, and were prevented from voting in many states until the 1960s as well. So certainly when we say the fight to vote for the right to vote, certainly looking at history, it's certainly one of the primary dots that build this constellation, right? That can hopefully guide us through what we need to do in addressing voter suppression. Voter suppression was also something that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about frequently, and he called them all types of conniving methods were still being used to prevent African Americans from registering to vote, because certainly during that time period, they could not even register to vote. And in the book, I share some firsthand accounts. Like one of my colleagues at the University of Baltimore School of Law shared an account from her mother, Miss Myrtle Pless Jones, who was a graduate of South Carolina State University and got her master's degree from Michigan State University. She married and lived in Montgomery, Alabama, where she had 2 children. This is in the 1950s. She went to register to vote and was asked how many bubbles are in a bar of soap, to which she replied around 100. She was told that that answer was incorrect and was not allowed to register, right? And so, and this is an example of certainly a literacy test and how those tests were applied depending on who was being asked, right? And so even Congressman John Lewis talked about, he grew up in Troy, Alabama. The types of literacy tests, it's how many bubbles on a bar of soap or how many beans are in a jar, right? And so whatever answer certainly African Americans came up with would have been the wrong answer, right? So that's an example of a literacy test. But they also had examples of literacy tests in New York State, where one of my colleagues from the Advancement Project National Office's grandmother migrated from Puerto Rico in 1951. Ms. Jimenez moved from Puerto Rico in 1951 and had to take a literacy test in order to vote in New York State. So it was certainly primarily in the former Confederate states, but it was also in other parts of the country as well, that these conniving methods existed and continue to prevent people from registering to vote. And so that period from the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is another one of those almost 100-year periods, one of those cycles. And so certainly had a cycle of progress after the passage of the Civil War amendments, but certainly a long cycle of regress with those constitutional conventions and the passage of those disenfranchising devices to 1965, where the Attorney General for the United States, as well as the Civil Rights Movement, was beckoning Congress and beckoning the President Lyndon Baines Johnson to pass some substantive legislation that could help address the systematic discrimination that was occurring, certainly in regards to the right to vote. And it was a Bloody Sunday, which you've seen pictures of with Congressman John Lewis and Reverend Hosea Williams leading a group of marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to highlight the efforts and the indignities that Black people face for trying to exercise a fundamental right and exercise the fundamental right to vote. And the Bloody Sunday video of those marchers being beaten certainly went across the world. And many point to that moment as where Congress and certainly President Johnson essentially said that a change needed to occur and that we needed to have legislation, because it was found that what was being demonstrated was that the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment were not enough. That there needed to be more legislation in place that would address certainly the practices that were occurring in the South. And as you can see from these voter registration rates, that there was a need, right? A desperate need for legislation in order to address these inequities, certainly in regards to the registration rate. So, and the Voting Rights Act not only assisted with the registration, but also with the exponential growth of candidates of color. And so there was exponential growth of candidates of color throughout the South and Southwest, as well as the registration rates in many states were close to or reached parity, certainly in this century. And the Voting Rights Act has some key provisions. One is Section 2, which is a nationwide prohibition against discrimination in voting based on language or race. And Section 5, which provided that certain jurisdictions, which were called covered jurisdictions, had to submit any of their changes, any voting changes, to the Attorney General for pre-clearance or approval before they could implement their changes. And so it was Sections 2 and Section 5 were certainly very important. We know that in 2013, the United States Supreme Court determined that there were parts of the Voting Rights Act that it found the parts were outdated. It said outdated and unconstitutional. It found that the triggering mechanism for, which was Section 4 of the Act, was outdated, and the mechanism that determined which jurisdictions had to submit their changes was outdated, and therefore without that triggering mechanism, there was no Section 5. So Section 5, we're living in a world without Section 5 now, and have been doing so since 2013, and we are seeing the impact of having less than a Voting Rights Act at its full strength. So with the Shelby County decision, we have certainly seen an uptick in voting changes that occur and are discriminatory. We saw, for example, in Texas, we've seen a number of instances, like, for example, the day of Shelby County decision, we saw the court, the state of Texas decided that it would implement a voter ID law, which only allowed for a military ID, passport, hunting license, and driver's license. At least 3 federal district courts found that voter ID law was intentionally discriminatory. Now, I know it's a public policy school. It is very hard to find something that's intentionally discriminatory. And in fact, courts found that there were more than 600,000 Black and brown people in Texas who did not have a driver's license, passport, military ID, or hunting license. Right? And so to find that, to have that voter ID law would not have been pre-cleared under Section 5. It had to be litigated under Section 2. I mean, the court said throughout the case that we still have Section 2. Well, Section 2 is reactive, whereas Section 5 was proactive. Section 2 is costly. The average cost of a Section 2 case is about $1.5 million. And the time period for a Section 2 case is about 2 years. And as compared to a Section 5 determination, which was 60 days. So not having the full strength of the Voting Rights Act is certainly telling, and it certainly helps to create some barriers to the ballot box. Now, one of the things I argue in the book is that there are certainly historical barriers to the ballot box, such as poll taxes and literacy tests, but they have some contemporary cousins. And those cousins are things like voter ID, voter deception, voter intimidation, and voter challenges, felon disenfranchisement, and certainly proof of citizenship laws, which are new found ways to do what was done certainly during those constitutional conventions in the early 1900s, which is to create and devise mechanisms that certainly not only make it harder, but certainly suppress the vote. They deter, they thwart, they prevent, in many respects, people of color in particular, but also young people, college students, elderly people, people of color from accessing the right to vote. An example of this is certainly told you about the voter ID in Texas, but also felon disenfranchisement. There are more than 6 million Americans who are disenfranchised, who cannot vote because of previous conviction of a felony. In a state like Florida, where the people actually spoke and said, we need to change this. And Florida essentially had a permanent disenfranchisement, that even if you had committed a crime and been convicted of a felony in the state of, let's say, Massachusetts, and had regained your right to vote in Massachusetts, if you moved to Florida, you just lost your right to vote. Right? Because Florida, each state determines which crimes are disenfranchising and what is the process for persons to regain their right to vote. And in Florida, you had to go before a clemency board. And Florida has more than 1.4 million people who are prevented from voting. And the people of Florida passed Amendment 4, which would have restored the right to vote to almost 1 million of those persons. And instead of their having the ability to register, the legislature decided that it would interpret the amendment, the constitutional amendment that 64% of Floridians voted for in November of 2018. In March and April of 2019, the legislatures in the state of Florida said, free at last, not so fast. That you cannot register until you paid all your fines, fees, and restitution. And this is also an example of the difference between Section 5 and Section 2, right? Section 5, legislature would not have been able to make that decision without it first being approved or pre-cleared, reviewed by the Department of Justice. And that review would have taken 60 days, and they would have been reviewing to determine whether or not the change was retrogressive. Did it put Black and brown voters in a worse position? So one can certainly see how having an amendment that says you have your right to vote restored under Amendment 4, and then having a legislature say, no, not until you do these things, would put voters in a worse position, and certainly they would have been considered retrogressive, and they would not have been able to implement it. Nonetheless, we see that this is still in litigation. There's those 880,000 persons have been told by courts because of Section 2, right? And because of litigation being the only mechanism available to contest the legislature's decision. This has been going on for more than a year. Those 880,000 people, many of them, unless they've paid their fines, fees, and restitution, do not have the right to vote. And it's also an example of felon disenfranchisement in the past, and certainly having this felon disenfranchisement, it's an example of felon disenfranchisement, which was established primarily in the early 1900s at those constitutional conventions, certainly having the same impact and effect today. That in a place like Florida, where about 20% of African Americans do not have the right to vote because the state of Florida has implemented this practice whereby they permanently disenfranchise voters. So about 20% of the Black community, or certainly about 60. So you have these percentages in regards to the percentages of persons, which is akin to a 3/5 compromise, where Black votes are not fully utilized, and certainly are counted as less than white voters. When we talk about voter suppression, can't have this discussion today without certainly talking about vote by mail and the impact that vote by mail has because of the pandemic, because of the coronavirus. Many localities, jurisdictions have loosened the requirements for vote by mail. Now, know that vote by mail has been around since the Civil War. So it is not new. Another one of these historical, like look at historically and then as well as contemporaneously. Vote by mail is not new. Now, in the recent past, vote by mail has only been used by elderly white people. Now that we've expanded it so that it is an option, and certainly a viable one, now we are hearing that it's problematic. Note that there are 5 states that use vote by mail exclusively without voter fraud issues, and they actually have higher turnout because of vote by mail, and we also have issues in regards to the postal service, right? There's a lot of back and forth over whether or not the actually mailing your vote in was a viable option. And to that, people were reminded that you can actually you can use drop boxes. And if you don't feel comfortable with the postal service being able to deliver your ballot in a timely fashion, you can use drop boxes. Well, and going back to Texas, in the state of Texas, in the last 2 weeks, the governor said that each county in the state of Texas will only have 1 drop box. Now, there are more than 250 counties in Texas. And for each of those counties to have 1 drop box is, the word I would use is absurd. A place like Harris County, Texas, had decided they would have 12 drop boxes. But the governor's decision 2 weeks ago, at about, a little more than 30 days, was approximately 32 days before November 3rd, when he decided that there would only be 1 drop box per county. Certainly, it no longer provides the opportunity for persons to use a drop box, so that they would, how do you get your ballot there? So that has also been in litigation in the last 2 weeks. And that's another example of how, if we still had Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that is a decision that would not have been, they would not have been able to implement. But we don't have Section 5, and going from to say that a place like Harris County, which is the 3rd largest county in the country, can only have 1 drop box, certainly makes it harder for people to vote, and certainly can suppress the vote. Another voter suppression tool that we're seeing more of is this militarization and weaponizing of voting places. Voter intimidation is a real issue with calls for paramilitary people and for people to come and watch the process, watch outside the polling place. Those are issues that people have great concern about. And again, this is not different from voter intimidation of the past. We've seen voter intimidation certainly during the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement and others, but it is certainly a concern that we need to address. So that's the fight to vote, right? And issues that we're certainly addressing, and there are more. But what are some of the solutions? This is a picture of Congressman John Lewis at the Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C., days before he went. Certainly that he went to the hospital the next day, but said that he just had to see it because he wanted to see it, certainly where it was located, and see what Mayor Bowser had done. But he also said it inspired him, and that he was inspired by the protests that have been happening in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. And they're very much like the protests that he had engaged in as a young man. Right? And he showed the protesters in his final letter that was aired on the day I think of his funeral, that was in the New York Times, that he was inspired, and that Emmett Till was his George Floyd, and that they should continue the fight, and that they should vote, right? And so how do you, in this fight to vote for the right to vote, certainly as Congressman Lewis has laid out for us all, is that we can move from protest to power by voting, right? So it's certainly one of the, and recognizing that there are powers that are trying to prevent us from doing so. But it's certainly say to certainly college students, if you're concerned about issues like criminal justice reform, the answer is voting. If you want to stop racism, or concerned about racial inequities, if you're concerned about gender equality or climate change. There are ways the vote is a connection to go from protest to power, right? And certainly to continue this fight to vote. So for example, if you're concerned about criminal justice reform in Georgia, you can, this year, you can elect the sheriff and the county attorney. Right? So if you're concerned that the sheriff didn't arrest the murderers of Ahmaud Arbery for months, or that the county attorney did not charge them for months, then guess what? You can determine who the sheriff is or who the county attorney will be, right? So there's a direct connection, but I ask people to do 4 things, and that's educate, legislate, litigate, participate. So that we can certainly continue this fight to vote and certainly move from protest to power. So educate yourselves about the voting process, for voting, know what the deadlines are, know what you need to go and vote. If you need an ID, what forms are acceptable, know all of those things, and not educate yourselves as well as others to make sure your family members know, your friends know, your colleagues know what the process is. Legislate, be aware of federal, state, and local level initiatives. There are bills that have been on Senator Mitch McConnell's desk for more than 200 days that would impact the ability of states to have the funds that they need and the machinery that they need and the people, and as well as the people that they need to process all of these vote by mail applications, as well as the vote by mail ballots and other needs that they might have. So contacting your elected officials to make sure that they are representing you well. And litigate, partnering with organizations, volunteering with organizations that are working on these issues when litigation is the option. The option. Demos is in Boston, as well as and is a very wonderful organization, along with Advancement Project National Office, LDF, Lawyers Committee, MALDEF, and others. And then finally, participate. You can become a poll worker. I think there's been a national effort to get folks to become poll workers. So all of those are things that you can do. And I found out, and as well as registering others to vote, found out about some wonderful organizations that can also help, like spreadthevote.org is an organization that I think certainly students will be interested in working with. Finally, I think it's important for us to recognize that although we've talked about certainly historically how voter suppression works and hopefully connected the dots, certainly how we see from history and looking at it more contemporaneously, the efforts that folk go to try to ensure that people don't have the right to vote or can't exercise the right to vote. And again, we're seeing that today with, one drop box or closing polling places, or long lines. We didn't talk about the long lines we've seen in Georgia. People waited 11 hours to vote, and this is supposed to be a model of democracy. And these issues certainly have some clear distinctions in regards to black and white, but I don't think we can make this a black and white issue or Republican Democrat issue. This is about our democracy and what we want our country to look like in regards to how we want it to function. And if the right to vote is central to democracy, then we need to make ways for it to for people to access the right to vote more freely, and certainly for them to be able to exercise that right freely, fairly, in a non-discriminatory manner. So it is important that we continue this fight to vote for the right to vote, because it certainly continues, and we have to see this as a war and battles along the way, and that we have to fight each of these battles as if we are winning the war, and certainly can end the war, so that we can have this system that creates a free, fair, non-discriminatory way of electing our representatives, and does so in a way that everyone is counted, and that we don't have anyone who's uncounted. So we want to ensure that, and we'll continue that fight, and hope that you will continue that in all the ways that we discussed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. So we've already got many questions in the chat, and if it's okay with you, I'm going to ask maybe sort of three people at a time to give questions. Is that all right, or do you want to do them one by one? We've got a bunch.
I can handle it.
Okay, I figured you could. So I think first we've got Jane, Lee. These are all faculty members, Jane, Lee, and Eric.
We just have practice getting our questions into the chat faster than the students from here. So, a skill we'll try to teach you guys. Thank you very much, Professor Daniels. That was a fantastic talk, inspiring and really informative, and I can't wait to read your book. I just popped in, what do you see as the most egregious or concerning states in the country? We all know different examples from different areas. But if you were going to say the, I don't know, top 3, top 5 states to be looking at with the election coming up, which ones would be on your list?
Ooh, I do have a list. Thank you so much, Professor Fountain. So at Advancement Project, we filed 2 lawsuits in the state of Florida since the pandemic. So the last one we filed 2 weeks ago on the 5th, because the 5th was the last day of voter registration, and the system, the online voter registration system crashed in Florida. And we filed a lawsuit along with Demos and Latino Justice for Deaf to extend the voter registration deadline. We had a hearing, filed some more papers, and on Friday, the 9th, the court, we had a hearing on the 8th. On the 9th, the court gave us this opinion, this beautiful opinion, where he said that the state had failed its citizens, and that it's, for some reason, Florida just can't get this election process right. He said all those things and then said to us, "But you don't win." So he, admitted that there were certainly problems and that those problems should have been addressed, but said, he thought that opening up voter registration again would create confusion, and it was so close to the election, which is what you run into at this point when we see problems, is that the court's response can be what they use, what's called the Purcell principle, which essentially says if it's too close to the election, then they're not going to make any changes. So Florida is certainly on the list because they have, these 64 supervisors of elections, and they all do things differently. Like, they all have different number of early voting days. They have different number of drop boxes. Some places, most places you can have your early voting. You can turn in your mail-in ballot at an early voting site, etc. They just have too many rules. So Florida, of course, is on the radar, not in these states I'm naming aren't necessarily because they're battleground states, but because their process and procedures have been demonstrated to certainly disenfranchise. The Secretary of State just said in Florida that they have sent out a list of supposed felons to be removed from the list, from the voter list. You cannot remove people from the voter registration list. It's against federal law to purge people less than 90 days before an election. We're how many days away? And the Secretary of State sending out a list. So they're doing those kinds of things, which certainly puts Florida high on the list. Another place is Georgia. So Georgia's high on the list because, you see those 11-hour lines? Right. So for every person who's looking at that saying, people are energized, people are going to participate. There are at least 5 people that are saying, I don't have time to stand in line. I don't have time. And it's a thing that we can fix. We can fix these long lines. And we've been saying long lines are a voter suppression tool for decades. But we're only now starting to look at it. So the list: Florida, Georgia, Texas, Pennsylvania. They just had a system with their naked ballots. That's the big issue with vote by mail, is if you don't follow the instructions, exactly, they are going to reject your ballot. For you don't, for example, I live in Maryland, they say use black ink. If you use blue ink, guess what they're going to do? Throw your ballot out. Those kinds of simple things can disenfranchise you. So those are the kinds of things that people need to be aware of. So there's Florida, Georgia, Texas, Pennsylvania, and I might say Michigan. But Michigan has an exceptional Secretary of State. She's a former voting rights attorney and professor at Michigan State University, Jocelyn Benson. But Michigan has implemented some new things like same-day voter registration, which is good. But I would probably add either Michigan or Arizona to that list, but probably Michigan. That's my list. That's my top 5.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm gonna go ahead and ask Lee, Eric, and Laura to ask your questions without pause, so then we can get Chelsea and Graham in too. Thank you.
And I'll be shorter with my answers. I'm sorry.
Thanks. Actually, I'll just say I voted by mail the other day, and my wife and I had an impassioned debate over whether a black pen, whether a Sharpie counted or not, because we don't want our votes to not count. Anyway, so Laura and I have similar questions, so I'll say mine and then maybe she should say hers. I mean, mine was, whether there has been any legislative efforts to try to restore Section 5 and that pre-clearance process. And Laura, do you want to pop in with the litigation question?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess my question would be, is there an attempt to revive it by litigation, or failing that, can we possibly try to build on the Shelby case and maybe find some way to recreate pre-clearance, but with a broader mandate to look at some of these states that are not former rebel states, right? And but are actually popping up with problems. Thank you.
Okay, so to the first, thank you both for those questions. And so for the first question, yes, there are legislative efforts in HR 1 and HR 4. So the first thing that this Congress did, right, and the fourth thing that this Congress did, certainly HR 4 is a more robust effort to try to restore parts of what was lost in Section 5. That has been on Mitch McConnell's desk for probably more than 150 days. No committee hearing, no vote. They've also looking to change the name. I think they may have recently changed the name to the John Lewis Voting Rights something in hopes that might persuade them to at least take it up, but so far nothing. And your question was, can we do something different if the legislative? So with the Shelby County decision, the court said to the Congress, you fix it, right? That they said it was, this trigger was outdated. So they laid it on Congress's feet. We just have not had the ability. I think it will take an act of Congress, I think, too, because I don't think you can do this administratively because Congress was acting under its authority given under the 14th and 15th Amendments. And we're gonna need Congress to act otherwise. Another effort that's being made to, in many ways, address this is there's a movement for a national right to vote amendment. Senator Dick Durbin presented a joint resolution a few weeks ago that includes a national right to vote. Because as you may know, this Constitution does not have an explicit right to vote. It has a lot of thou shalt nots. Thou shalt not discriminate based on race. Thou shalt not discriminate based on gender. Thou shalt not discriminate against persons who are 18 and over. But it doesn't give an affirmative right to vote, right? For example, you have the right to free speech. You have the right to bear arms. We don't have anything in the Constitution that says you have the right to vote. And so there are discussions going on, scholarly discussions and policy discussions about whether or not an explicit right to vote can help eliminate or certainly mitigate some of these voter suppressive measures. That if there is an affirmative right to vote in the Constitution, would that then address some of these voter suppression laws? So those are the kinds of discussions that are going on.
Thank you. So we've got Eric still waiting, and Chelsea and Graham, and I guess, go ahead, the three of you, and ask your questions, and then we might have time for one last one after that. Thank you.
Okay, very quickly, the suppression of votes makes it very hard to tell how many of the roughly 2/5 of Americans who don't vote even in a presidential election are not voting because they've been prevented, or how many have just not bothered. And so I raised the question that comes up from time to time, that should we also make as well as opening the door, should we also give people kicks in the pants through compulsory voting?
Mhm.
Which sounds very authoritarian, except countries like Australia and Belgium, I believe,
Right.
several other European countries have that system.
Right. So compulsory voting is something that we talk about. We say, oh, well, other people do it, and maybe we should. But it's like then I've had my students who have said, why don't we? It's like a tax credit if you vote, or a tax penalty if you don't. In Australia, I think it's a $50 fine if you don't vote, and that's and so all these measures would suggest that we actually want people to vote, which there are those of us who do, right? But there are people who are actively pursuing methods that would ensure that people don't get the opportunity to vote. And I think those people are the ones who, as you say, would say that compulsory voting is authoritarian and that it's un-American to force somebody to actually vote. So we just probably have a back and forth on that. But I don't think compulsory voting is going to win here, but I do think there are other things that we can do. And I say, I say in a paper that I just wrote for UC Berkeley, it's called Democracy's Destiny, where I talk about how we're dancing around the edges. Like, oh, let's do same day. Everybody has to do same day voter registration, or everybody, let's just get to the heart of the matter. Let's get rid of some of these mechanisms that have been put in place that just make it hard. And let's have an explicit right to vote, or do something that certainly encourages turnout and participation.
Great, thank you. So we have questions still from Chelsea and Graham. Go ahead, Chelsea. And again, maybe we'll let Graham do his question too.
Okay.
Thanks, Gilda.
Thank you so much, Professor Daniels. This was very illuminating and helpful. My question to you is, how are you able to access and practice hope that one day this fight against voter suppression will be finished?
Well, so I guess I can show you a little about my background. Before when it was in voting law, I've represented death row inmates and brought prison condition cases in Alabama and Georgia. So I have to be hopeful, right? So, and so, coming from that, then I moved from representing death row inmates and prison condition cases to voting, because I wanted to do more of what I consider more mainstream civil rights work. And I think it's just the nature of doing the work that you want to believe that what you're doing is going to create change, right? And so you have to be, because if I didn't believe that, the work would help 10,000 people, 500 people, 5 people to have the ability to register or to participate, then why do the work, right? So it's understanding that this is a marathon, not a sprint. That you have to be strategic, and that you have to take steps along the way to get to the ultimate goal, which is universal suffrage for me, right? Just like, working the death penalty, it's like, let's get rid of the death penalty. What about universal suffrage? You have the right to vote. Can we get there, right? And so that's how I can be hopeful and hopeful that, the work that I'm doing, and my colleagues and others who are interested in the work that you all are doing, right? Registering people to vote, signing up as poll workers, that all those are things that are helping us to become the country that we want it to be.
Thank you. That's wonderful. It's very inspiring. Graham, go ahead.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm curious, and sort of to preface the question that I wrote, what political institutions are behind the suppression? Is it ALEC? Is it who else? And then after that, like, what is the future of voting? I know the Utah Republican Party implemented blockchain in their primary this year, mobile voting. And do you see that addressing some of these concerns sort of with a new slate?
Yeah, yes, it keeps changing in regards to the future of voting, and also in regards to the future of voting, of answering your second question first, in regards to the future of voting, it's also can be used as a tool in voter deception, right? Then the book I talk about how there was a group of students that were told if you just tweet #Hillary, then you would have cast your vote for president. We cannot hashtag votes. You cannot tweet your vote. You cannot put it on Facebook or Insta or TikTok your vote. You have to use the mechanisms that are available: mail-in voting, early voting, in-person voting on election day. So we're not at online. I just told you how some states can't even do online voter registration. So you had to break down in online voter registration in Florida and in Georgia on the last day. So we haven't even gotten online voter registration. So, online voting is somewhere afar off. And we have other things we certainly need to fix like the electoral college and access issues. Graham, remind me, what was your first question?
Oh, who are the primary political institutions behind the movement to maintain voter suppression? If it's ALEC or other groups?
Well, so certainly voter suppression is a system, right? And I think there are groups that are working to make it harder, and certainly make it harder in this area. In times of Reconstruction, it was the Republicans were the progressive group, and the Democrats were the segregationists. And so, the parties might change, but the impact's the same, right? I know, in regards, I know with the voter ID, we certainly have, not the Koch brothers have certainly done a lot of funding on this issue, but the Koch brothers have also been strange bedfellows with felon disenfranchisement and re-enfranchisement. Right. So they they're bad on some things, but tolerable on others. Alec, and what is his name from Kansas? Graham, you know his name. The proof of citizenship law. He ran for attorney general, and then he ran for Senate. He was the president's.
Kobach.
Thank you. Yeah, Chris Kobach has certainly been the architect of a number of these things, like vote ID and proof of citizenship laws, all things under this guise of voter fraud, which does not exist. I'm so glad y'all didn't ask me questions about voter fraud, because I spend too much time talking about something that doesn't exist. Literally doesn't exist. Like, we can prove that we don't have voter fraud. And someone asked me for the data on voter suppression. I'm like, okay, you want to know about the 600,000 in Texas or the 1.4 million in Florida? Do you want to know about the number of polling places that have been closed? Do you want to know it's like, I have numbers. But they want data for voter suppression. But then when you say voter fraud, they say, oh, but that's hard to detect. But you want me to prove it? And I'm telling you that it doesn't exist. So you certainly have those folks. But the thing is, controlling the narrative is the issue. Why you know more about voter fraud than voter suppression, right? Because it's who's controlling the narrative, and we have to get on. We folk who care about expanding access have to do a better job of telling the story. So I'm glad there's a reporter on here, so hopefully she'll tell the story. She or he will tell the story that needs to be told.
Professor Daniels, I wish it's delightful that we could have an hour with you, and thank you so much. And I can see that we could, have another 2 or 3 hours, and we would just be scratching the surface, and I wish we could. But in the absence of being able to have you for longer, I very much encourage people to pick up the book. It's Uncounted. It's very, very readable, and it's very comprehensive in the range of voter suppression stuff that it covers. I also want to give a quick shout out to students and colleagues from UC Riverside who've been joining this. And the last thing I want to say is, yes, vote, do all that you can in the next few weeks. I know we're all kind of tired and overwhelmed with all this stuff, but now is the time. And I will look forward to seeing many of you a couple days after the election, and, we can debrief on what we've all been able to do and what we've learned. So thank you again to everybody, and see you all soon.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Professor Daniels. Be well, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.